Yeah.
I feel
Hey,
like John should sing us an intro song at least.
I'm not a good singer.
everyone. That's a lie. I've heard you sing, I think. Okay, so
All
we're
right, well,
recording. It's on now.
okay.
Um,
Well, okay, so this is our second Fireside chat, and we've done some upgrades. So I've got my fire over here, and
I got my candle.
you still got your fire there, and then
I got my fire in a
John's
cup.
there. You go. So we're staying
Oh, I
warm.
love that cup. Mine actually cracked recently because I put it in the dishwasher. Don't tell Caitlin because she got it for me as a gift.
Oh, I had the Detroit one. She got me for a gift and I broke it. So this
Oh
was her
man, I was gonna text her. It just broke this week. So sorry. This is shout out to
So
these
maybe we should
really awesome
introduce
whiskey
John.
glasses. Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so we should introduce John.
Sure, go ahead.
So John, as a fellow community member of the Windsor Downtown Neighborhood Alliance, has been showing up for meetings just as long as we all have been, and does a lot of his own work as well. John, you want to tell us about your connections with downtown and just a little background about your living experience here in the downtown area of Windsor?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt and Sarah, for having me. My name's Jonathan Choquette. I live downtown on Wyandotte, between Park and Dougal. And what?
You
I
just
said
said you lived on Wyandotte. You don't live on Wyandotte.
I was trying to be like not specific.
Oh, I was
just
gonna
so I didn't
say,
feel-
how much whiskey have you really had?
Yeah. We last episode we actually gave our exact address and put pictures of our houses.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I live on Dougal near Wyandotte, just to be more clear. And I've lived downtown here in my current home since 2016. And a couple of things that drew me to downtown. Well, one, I have a family history here. So the house that I live in right now was actually owned by my father 20 years ago. And I've had different family members who lived here renting rooms off him. And I bought it from the man who bought it from my dad. And my sister and her family actually live 4 doors down. And I remember coming to my dad's rooming houses on this block as a kid. So I have a lot of memories here. I didn't actually grow up in downtown, but it feels like home. And so in addition to that family connection, downtown is, if you look at walk score, the most walkable neighborhood, not only in Windsor but in the county, based on the walk score numbers.
I knew you were going to bring up the walk
I'm
score.
a real.
It's your
How could I
favorite thing to
not?
say
I
about
mean,
the downtown.
Well, we're talking about environment, right? And if we want to talk about limiting your environmental impact, then what better way to limit our need of driving, right? So living downtown, being able to walk to the post office and so on to do errands or bike is great. And we only need to have one. Well, we can rely on active transportation. So that's one of the other reasons that drew me to living downtown. And also, as we're talking about environment today, I'm a conservation biologist. I work with endangered species. I see on a regular basis the impact of suburban sprawl, of continuing to build houses on endangered species habitat. And so I, not wanting to be part of creating that demand and seeing all the vacant properties downtown, I think it's important for me to practice what I preach and live in the urban center, and therefore reduce the demand on suburban type sprawl on the outskirts of the city. So those are the 3 main reasons that drew me to downtown.
John, I have to jump in and say, you're locally famous, and I think you're known as the snake guy. I think that's what you're known as.
For good reasons.
For
My
good
kids
reasons.
call me that.
But no, just
I like snakes.
I was gonna say, and to give a shout out to the work that you do a lot of work with endangered species, the snakes. I believe in. Oh, you can speak more about this than I can, but you're doing your PhD on is it the Massasauga rattlesnakes? Did I get it right this time?
Yeah, it's not the Mississauga or the Mississauga, but people often call them those. It's actually the Massasauga. And yeah, so in addition to being a lead biologist with Wildlife Preservation Canada, I am also doing my PhD part-time. University, a bit of a sad story about Laurentian University right now. Some of you may have heard they've filed for bankruptcy protection, and the first
I didn't know that.
college, yeah, it's big news. Look it up. First college university in Ontario to be in such dire financial straits. So that's really unfortunate for the Laurentian community and for everybody up in Sudbury. I'm a student at Laurentian. I'm supervised there, but I also have a co-supervisor here at the University of Windsor. And all of my schooling right now is remote because I live and work here in Windsor.
Okay, cool. I didn't know that.
So I got a little story about the the rattlesnake from this area. But so when I was like about between 7 and 10 years old, I saw one on my driveway at my house out in South Windsor. And I told everybody, and nobody believed me. I saw a rattlesnake. And for the longest time, they'd convinced me I was a liar and I didn't see it. And I know I heard a rattlesnake. And then afterwards, when I think it was when they were talking about the Ojibwe Park expansion for the big box store there, the rattlesnake came up in the comments, and I looked up to it, and that's kind of like gave me that like, oh, maybe I did actually see that rattlesnake. But for all that time, like I was convinced that I somehow just was a liar out of nowhere. I saw this snake and thought it was a rattlesnake. I feel like do they not? Have you ever heard one rattle their tail?
Yeah. I wouldn't call you a liar. You may have very well seen a rattlesnake, and I'd like to know where you grew up. But there's also the possibility that you saw an eastern fox snake. Now, we have another snake in this area that is actually a rattlesnake mimic, and it looks like a rattlesnake. It vibrates its tail like a rattlesnake. However, to the trained eye, you can tell the difference, but to the untrained eye, people mistake them all the time.
But do they make a sound?
Yeah, so the rattlesnake is unique in the snake world in that it actually has this little, at least for Massasaugas, it's little, for bigger rattlesnakes, it's longer, but this little appendage at the end of its tail that's made of dried scales, essentially. And then there are individual rattle segments that are like interlocking. And as they vibrate their tail, those interlocking segments vibrate against each other and make sort of a buzzing sound. And because the small rattlesnake, it's not as loud as some of the bigger rattlesnakes in the south. Mm-hmm. However, the mimic that we have, the eastern fox snake, will also shake its tail really fast. And now it doesn't have a rattle, like its tail's pointy. However, if it's rattling against a surface or dried leaves, you could easily mistake it for a rattlesnake.
I feel like you just went into Professor
well, we got a bunch
mode with
snake. Yeah, this has become the snake episode.
Environment is a big term, right? But hold on a second before we go further. Matt,
okay.
Where did you grow up in South Windsor? I want to know where this observation happened.
I grew up in you know where the Legion is in South Windsor, or where it used to be. You know where Talbot turns into Huron Church turns into Talbot. Or it used to, like, you got to go back to like before their Gray Parkway was built.
Yeah.
So I used to live on the LaSalle side. I actually lived in LaSalle because on the other side was Windsor and one side was LaSalle. And I was right at the fork where Huron Church divvied off from the rest of Highway 3 before it kicked out to the 401.
So Huron Church line or Huron Church, what is that?
Oh my goodness, don't get me started on that street. It's Huron line, Huron Church Road, Huron Church line. Like and it depends on what block you're on.
But the main highway curves off, and then there's like Huron Church Line Road or something, right?
It's the offshoot that goes into Deep LaSalle.
And right now, that's right near where Normandy comes out and hits it.
Right.
There used to be rattlesnakes there. Not actually as recently as probably the 90s, 80s.
This would have been about the 90s.
Yeah. We'll have to talk about that later. I'd like to see on the map where you actually live.
I'm going to steer this conversation back to the matters at hand.
It's environment, right? But that's environment.
That is obviously environment. That's totally environment. But it's not downtown environment.
Maybe that should be the first place we should hit is the whole idea of environment, because we're obviously talking about animals, and it brings to light like images of trees and meadows, and people downtown are concerned about their environment, but sometimes people have a hard time understanding what the heck we're talking about because there are no forests or meadows. It's urban. What does that mean? Environment downtown?
There's the urban forest, Matt. Well, the environment. I see the environment as everything around us, the air and the soil and the water and then the natural vegetation, and of course us and our buildings. I mean, we are another species amongst many species, and cities are our habitations, right? They're essentially like human dominated environments. And so it's an urban environment is what it is. And it's very different from a more natural environment that you might find out in a forest outside of the city.
I was going to say, John, one thing I've always appreciated, like I've known you for, I don't even know how long, 5 years or so. One of the things I've always appreciated whenever I'm like, we're around and we're outside, which is usually the case, you're always like, oh, there's that tree species. And then there's that random plant. And then there's that bird that's flying. And I don't actually naturally pick up on these things like living in an urban environment. But I think that because you're trained in this area, you naturally see not just the buildings, you see all of the the more like natural environment that sometimes I think we miss out on, just like being urban city dwellers. And I remember like there was one time I think I was sitting on your front porch and you were like, oh, there's that bird song. Like you heard the bird noise. And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about right now, but you had picked up on like a bird call. And I think that you have this really unique talent of doing like, I always just appreciate that because of your, I never pick up on that stuff. But I guess to go off that point, one of the questions that I have is what kind of wildlife do we have downtown? And is it different than, let's say, like, where Matt was out in LaSalle? Like I grew up in LaSalle, or where you typically study, in Ojibwe and stuff like that. Did I cut out for a second there? Did you get that question?
Yeah,
Sorry.
it is quite. Yeah, you did, but I'm just waiting. I just wanted to make sure we were caught up and that it wasn't me lagging. Yeah, Sarah, thanks for that. And I think part of it is just being trained as a biologist and the awareness of the fact that there are many other creatures aside from humans on our planet, even in cities. And as humans and stuck in our social media worlds, we tend to be really focused on our human gossip and our human goings on, but there's a lot going on around there if we just listen for it, right? And in an urban center, there is a lot of life, even though it's dominated by, I guess what we can see is, in fact, it's dominated by humans. But there are a lot of other creatures out here, and a couple examples. Cooper's hawk is a really cool one, a bird of prey that we actually have seen multiple on our tree. We're like, we can just watch it from our window, feeding on a pigeon. And it was the coolest thing to watch, and me and my kids were loving it. It was great. And you guys are aware of the Monarch Butterfly Way project that we've been working on with multiple Monarch station. And so species of butterflies right in the middle of the city. We had some really rare insects. Midas flies, two different species of insects found, one in our butterfly garden and one in our backyard, that I looked on this iNaturalist website online, and they're like the only observations in Windsor. Like, it's crazy. So it's amazing when you actually looking for some of these creatures, what you can find. And speaking of snakes, we actually, right next to downtown, in a sort of like linear corridor, rail corridor habitats, we have snakes. We have not rattlesnakes, but we have an endangered garter snakes. Like, it's really cool. So there's actually lots of different creatures, and then you can just talk about the river. You go to the river and you can see gulls flying and ducks sitting in the river, and even water snakes living along the shores of the Detroit River. So there is life in cities, but I mean, we have to also recognize that just the physical nature of cities being dominated by buildings and roads and lawns, there are many creatures that just can't tolerate living in an urban environment. And there are many species of birds that are sensitive to fragmentation. Things like frogs and snakes and turtles get killed on roads. So the minute you have this grid, with very little natural habitat, all of a sudden you've wiped out opportunity for just a whole slew of different plants and animals. So yeah, very limited biodiversity compared to even just the Ojibwe Prairie, which is in a city, but it's a big natural area, or out in some more rural natural areas. But let's not disregard the fact that there is still a lot of nature in our cities, in our yards, and there's actually a lot of opportunity to attract more nature to our front yards, to our backyards, than I think we often give cities credit.
Now, I just don't want to disclaimer, like I know that we're asking you these questions that are probably pretty loaded for environmentalists to just ask what kind of wildlife we have in a certain area. Like going up and down the flora and fauna could probably take a few weeks, I'm sure. But I do appreciate you taking the time and kind of like highlighting some of these, because I think it is really important for us to understand what's going on around us. And one thing that I do notice with plants, and I put a tree out in my front yard, and when I called up the city, we spoke about specifically having to have trees that are native to our area when they plant them. And then it occurred to me that we do have similar trees all around our downtown neighborhood, and that we're following some kind of plan here. And like it kind of started begging the question to me, like, why is it so important that we put trees and vegetation downtown? Like, why bother? We got buildings, we've got shade from buildings. Why do we need trees in the middle of our downtown streets? Why do we need grass? Like, what is the importance of vegetation for not just for the people to see it and say, hey, that's pretty, but what about for how does that improve the lives of the downtown residents?
Well, I think that first off, as humans and having evolved in natural environments with lots of vegetation, we are naturally attracted to greenery. We love plants, we love flowers, we put plants in our houses. We love trees. I think it's in between people and plants. First of all, I think that's important to recognize. But when we talk, and then we can also talk about some of the, I guess, more the functions, ecological functions that let's just use trees for an example that provide us. And I mean, you mentioned shade. I mean, trees do provide shade, not just for our buildings, like they shade our buildings and actually limit our cooling costs in the summertime, but they also shade us. And we know that cities in general are hotter than the rural landscapes around them. And we know that cities will get hotter in a warming climate. And so trees are a natural way to provide additional shade, not only for buildings to limit our cooling costs, but also just for us being outside, especially vulnerable people like elderly when they're outside on really hot days. I mean, what's better than like standing under the shade of a tree when you're just like sweating and just exhausted from the heat, right? Like trees are important in that respect. They also capture pollutants. And we know that Windsor historically has had an air pollution problem with a lot of particulate matter coming in from blowing in from the American side. And vegetation helps trap pollutants on the leaves. Of course, oxygen provided to us, so that's an important aspect. Trees provide habitat. We talked about wildlife. I wouldn't have seen that Cooper's hawk in my front yard. My kids wouldn't have that experience to be connected to nature, which we know we need more of because it's easier and easier to become disconnected to nature. But we wouldn't have had that experience if they would have cut that tree down. And they tried twice. they
I remember you told me this story. You were like, every time.
Was this a front yard tree?
Yeah, the front yard tree. Actually, because I mentioned that my dad had owned this house in the past, my uncle had lived here with my aunt and my young cousin, and he planted that tree many years ago. So it's not a native tree. I would like to replace all of my plants in my yard with native plants, but it's there, and my uncle planted it and it has a function. And anyways, yeah.
It's a really beautiful tree. I feel like part of the reason why I know I like to live downtown is because of the tree coverage. That's a really distinct thing. I think in older neighborhoods, we're not the only one, but yeah, I've known a number of residents who've had to go outside and fight city workers not to cut down their tree because they're just on like a schedule of like trimming, which it actually sometimes is like that needs to happen, but then sometimes they go to cut down the whole thing or something like that. Um, but I fully appreciate that because I think the tree coverage in our neighborhood is really, really important. I did have a question about that though, actually, because I was thinking about this. One of the things I found, well, I hear a lot from other residents who have lived downtown or in other parts of our city is we don't have a lot of green space. We don't have as much green space as we would in other cities. There's not a lot of trails and there's not as much, park with like really treed, naturalized like bush areas. Um, what do you think about that? I have my own thoughts and opinions about that, but I'm just curious, how you would respond to that comment.
Well, I wouldn't be able to give you a number in terms of the percent of natural area that Windsor has, and then compare that to other cities off the top of my head. I'd have to look into it. Um, and I don't know. I think it really depends on where you live in the city.
Well,
And
I can elaborate a bit more. I think one of the things that I think that people really value, like you said, is tree coverage. It's all these things. And I think even more so now with the pandemic, there's a lot of walking that's happening and a lot more people are getting outdoors. And, I notice that a lot of people are, they'll hop in their car and they'll go to Ojibwe. Like I went one Sunday to Ojibwe and I'm like, it was actually so packed that I'm like, I don't believe people are actually social distancing right now. So we ended up going to another, I think we went into the middle of the county. We went to the Chrysler Greenway, which is ironic because, I'm living downtown in like the most walkable neighborhood and I left to go. And I also live close to the riverfront, so I can easily walk to the riverfront and I do that trail quite often. I think that I've seen in other cities, and I know that you used to live in Guelph for a bit, John, too, and I know that you did too, Matt. And I've seen in other and I also think of Portland, Oregon, because I've been there a couple times. I used to have family there. They would have these like massive parks in the middle of the city that were actually like very heavily treed, like forests. And I'm just curious if do you think something like that is missing? Or do you think that we have access to a lot of green space within close proximity? And that's actually a really good thing. Like, I'm just curious, more of like an opinion, not necessarily as much as like the data. I think there's something to be said about like, can we access like sufficient quiet green space close to our like homes? Do you know what I mean?
yeah, I think that our when it comes to parks and green space, we tend to focus on mowed lawn and ornamental type plantings. And at least personally, I feel like that's not very natural, and I don't feel the same going to a mowed lawn as I do going to Ojibwe Prairie, like you mentioned. Just aesthetically, I find natural settings more beautiful than mowed lawns, but people can argue the opposite. And so, from my perspective, I think that we need more green space, but actually not just mowed lawn space, more natural type environments. And I think that brings a lot of benefits in terms of the peace and tranquility that you feel in a green space because there's more sound of, the grass is rustling that it brings. There's more insect noises. And I think that that is something that is lacking and that we could do better at. I also think that in terms of access to like important green spaces, that we should have better access to things like national parks. And our closest national park is, for example, Point Pelee. But we actually have, this is a bit of a sidebar, but we actually have a great opportunity to advocate for the next national urban park at Ojibwe Prairie. I know Brian Massey has been advocating for this and working on this, and there's actually some interest at the federal level, and there's been some news articles about this recently on the willingness and the feasibility of actually creating the second national urban park at Ojibwe Prairie and bringing in extra federal funds to buy more land and to protect more green space and actually have like a national class park accessible to Windsorites and others in the region. And I think that would just be fantastic.
So when you talk about these natural spaces, I'll admit they are beautiful. I get that. Going through a hike in Point Pelee is a lot different than walking through a manicured lawn at Jackson Park. They both have their benefits and why one's good for one situation, another one's good for another situation. But I get the appeal. The one thing that does scare me when you talk about that in a downtown area is I feel like in Windsor we have a problem with a lot of dumping, especially downtown. And I mean, I walk the alleys with my kids all the time, and I got to teach them not to pick up trash, to not jump on mattresses. And I just see that if you put these natural unkept grasses, although they have a benefit and we're trying to promote this naturalized area, naturalized to one person is ignored and unkept to another person. And that's kind of inviting for that trash dumping. And in a place like Windsor, where we have a problem with dumping things in our alleys, and it's not normally the residents. I'll throw it out there right away. It's not the time I know that it's when there's an eviction of a tenant or the landlord has a switch over in tenants, a lot of their stuff just gets thrown in the alley or something. And I am sure there are some bad players in there that are residents, but I want to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. I guess before we can start moving into having these naturalized park spaces, me as the resident downtown, I would say first, let's take care of the dumping issue. Is there a solution to taking care of dumping in alleys in our downtown environment?
Ooh,
This is a good question for John.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I have the solution, but I guess I can start by giving a bit of my experience to add to that. I guess I'm gonna stray away a bit from the whole connection between naturalized spaces and dumping, and maybe just talk a little bit about my experience living on a block with an alley and dumping. And so I adopted my street through the Adopt a Street program, which is a program that the city runs that allows residents to, I guess, feel more engaged in their neighborhood. And you sign a contract that says you're going to do X number of cleanups and so on. So anyways, myself and in partnership with the DWCC, we've done a number of cleanups on my street and on my alley and on neighboring streets to address the dumping problem. And I must say that it's very frustrating as a resident to have people, whether they live on your block or not, come in and bring junk and mattresses and things for that, like you as a resident have to deal with, and in terms of look at and bring yourself to the landfill because someone didn't want to do it. So it is frustrating. It's a frustrating problem, and I imagine I'm not the only one who deals with it. And I can see how people would just like give up, because it does seem like it's an ongoing issue. And even not just dumping furniture, but one thing that we experience here is just people bring bags and sorting through them for stuff, I don't know, resources of some kind. And then the rubbish just blows everywhere. And now you have a litter problem, right? And then you got to clean up all that litter and it just blows all over. I will say that when you deal with the majority of like historical dumping, you kind of can address the problem, but there's an ongoing maintenance issue. And I think that one of the problems is we've ignored our alleys. Alleys were designed, my understanding is that alleys were designed as a functional way to save space in dense urban, concentrate the kind of utilitarian uses to the back, right? And then you have like the gardens and the nice spaces in the front. And at least in my street, on other streets, I noticed this kind of, and this has probably been a long process, this sort of turning away from the alleys, putting up fences, instead of having your shared driveway being the alley and then like a parking space behind your house. Now people put driveways in the front, like take out gardens and put the driveways in, and then put fences in the back. And then the alley becomes a bit of a forgotten space, right? And you know what forgotten spaces encourage, perhaps along the same lines as your theory about the natural spaces encouraging this, forgotten spaces that aren't taken care of, whether they're natural or unnatural, encourage this kind of this dumping behavior, in my opinion. And so I think one of the issues, and I think dumping happens where nobody's looking, right? Like, where do you want to go and dump something in a kind of a hidden place? Maybe it's a natural area where no one's looking. Maybe it's like an alley where there's all fences and no one can see you. If it looks like it's ignored and forgotten, and no one is watching you, I think then it's easier to dump. And one possible issue is how we're using alleys, and to find ways to encourage more positive uses of alleys, so there's more people using the spaces in a good way, like the residents, and more eyes on the alley. If you're looking at your alley and using it and someone comes in to dump a mattress off next to you, are you just going to stand there and watch them do it? Or are you going to be like, buddy, please don't
I always
dump
call
that mattress?
people out all the time. Yeah. I want to jump in actually, John, because I think there's two things that I thought of when you were just talking right now, because I think, alleys are a bit of a passion of mine as well. But one of the things, the connection I wanted to make was because you were like, oh, I'm going to disconnect the naturalized spaces and dumping. But one of the things that I know that you've done is you've strategically placed I'll say brush or plants. I'll use the term loosely, guerrilla gardening, and as a way to deter dumping. Like, one of the things I remember that you did with your alley was that you noticed that people were dumping in this one spot on I think it was like a vacant lot actually. Which actually, did you notice there's a development building now? They're building there now, which is awesome. But you planted raspberry bushes there, and I think, I mean, you can tell a story better than I can, but I think you had said that like that discouraged dumping, but then somebody went and cut them down because they thought that they were just like random bushes. I can't remember
Before
exactly.
John addresses that, can I just jump in with the term you coined? I don't know if you coined it or if this is actually used, but guerrilla gardening, I mean, it works for like guerrilla warfare and everything, because you don't connect the naturalization, like the nature with the actual human event. But when I think like butterfly gardens, I'm thinking of gardens for butterflies. And when you said guerrilla gardening, in my head, I've got two images. One is someone planting a garden to attract gorillas, and the other one is the gorillas are doing the planting.
No.
I
Guerrilla
had to
as
jump
in
in. It just popped in my head.
Guerilla. And it is a legit term. This is a term that I think you can coin. I mean, it's like guerrilla, like warfare is, I mean, the other term that comes to mind, but it's a way that's just like unsanctioned gardening in areas to encourage some kind of behavior or to change the like physical landscape.
Or
And I think,
guerrilla bicycle paths.
yes, guerrilla, yeah, there's a lot of ways you can use the term, but yeah, but I think that connection to me was made when you were like, I don't want people dumping in my alley anymore, so I'm going to plant some bushes and see what happens here. And it was almost like an experiment. And I was like, that's smart. Like, and I just think that like, that's the power of having somebody who, you adopted your street and your alley. So you're obviously caring about it and monitoring it, but then also like have the ability to like, use nature or use like your knowledge of then I'll say the natural environment in a strategic way to kind of encourage a different, or I should say discourage negative behaviors, right? And you're now checking on those plants, you're there more. I don't want to take away from like your comments about dumping. I think that it's true, and you can't solve everything with guerrilla gardening, but I do think that, the average citizen taking control of their space, both like via planting, like even like turning their front lawn away from a lawn and into more of a naturalized space, actually encourages, like, this is the type of city that we want to live in. Like, we don't want to live in a city where people just can dump wherever. We don't want to live in a city that doesn't have naturalized spaces, so we can create them on our own little plot of land. I know you and I've had this like empowerment conversation, but like that's what I think of when I think of some of the work that you do downtown. This was a tangent back to just say, I if you want to talk about guerrilla gardening, you can, but I know you're a little bit covert about it.
No, I mean, I talked to the, it's a strip of ground next to the alley that's part in the city right away and part on the adjacent vacant lots, and the owner was fine with it. I talked to him about it. So there's no sort of.
Oh, you did talk to the owner. Okay, I feel better about making that. I'm glad we can talk about this openly then.
There's no covertness about it, but also I think it's important to take ownership of your city, and particularly take ownership of the space that you use. And I see the alleys as it's my driveway. It's not just my driveway, it's my neighbor's driveways, and it's a shared driveway. And I want it to look nice, and I want it to be functional, and I want it to be a positive space that I can use, my kids can use, that is not dominated by negativity, for lack of what that includes. And so, yeah, contrary to what some people think, no, there's no wild population of gorillas roaming downtown. This is just a way of taking ownership of an underused space. And in this particular case, I saw a fairly wide, maybe a meter wide strip of ground between the alley and the fence. And people were dumping large furniture and things there, doing other activities that I didn't think were appropriate for my alley. And so I figured, well, maybe if I plant some prickly raspberry bushes, it'll to show that it's being cared for. Now, back to a previous point, there's cues to care. And so you can have a messy natural area, but if you do certain things to show people that it's intentional, then it sort of alleviates our need to judge that person who's not taking care of the space, right? So there are ways that we can have natural spaces and actually show that we're caring for them. Like signage is one, clean borders is another. It's the landscape architecture literature has some pretty good examples. But anyways, yeah, it was a way to plant some food. I mean, I love raspberries. My kids love them. It was a way to sort of like have a positive space in the alley. We could go and pick raspberries in the summer, and ideally over time, if those raspberries created a bit of a bramble, then it would be prickly, so it would prevent people from sort of getting in there and just take up the space. And so, you know, I would think generally you're going to dump somewhere that's easy than somewhere where you got to like get into like a bramble to dump. It's not it's not the best. I could probably do better at the planting job there, but I thought it was a fun little project, and it did get cut a couple times. Some of the plants got cut and I had to replace some of them. But yeah, it's fun to experiment with your space. And for me, that was planting some raspberry bushes. For you, Sarah, or for you, Matt, that might be something completely different.
Now, I know that what you talked about with in terms of making the alley look like it's being used kind of deters a lot of the dumping. I know that when we're going to do an episode on safety and security, and that's going to tie into that as well, because that's a way to kind of deter crime from taking place in the alleys. And I also just want to also do a little side note here, because these episodes we're right now kind of focusing on the life of living downtown and but I don't want people to think that we are ignorant of the fact that the city could easily do a lot of things too. The city can always enact a large item pickup. The city can always add lighting to the alleys to prevent people from dumping at night. The city can always maintain the alleys better so it doesn't look like it is a dump. So there is lots that we can do as a city through the city government, but we're kind of just talking more about our shared experiences and things that we've done right now, and certainly maybe we can explore those subjects as they become more and more relevant in our lives.
Yeah, I think just on that point, Matt, I think you're totally right. And I think that to tie it back to the WDNA for a minute, you know, John, you were the environment, the chair of the environment working group when we were meeting for the last few years. And I think that, to Matt's point, what part of what we were trying to do was build capacity to advocate for some of these things. And I think, you know, one of the things I know that you were working on and have been still working on, regardless of you know, a pandemic or whoever wanted to be involved, was the Butterfly Way, which was, you know, a citizen-led project to get more butterfly way stations downtown. Before I ask you a bit about that, I also was just thinking, like, what are some of the other environmental supports, or I don't know if supports is the right word. I'm thinking, you know, what are some of the things that we can advocate for to not just on dumping, but more in terms of like, protecting our environment within the context of like an urban space like the downtown, and wondering if like you have any thoughts on that, up to and including like the work that you were doing with the Butterfly Way.
Yeah, I think I don't really have any thoughts on that. Maybe just because when I hear environment, it's just so broad, um, and it can relate to a lot of things. So I mean, maybe you'd have to prod me a little bit more about that to try to
Well,
get some things out.
I think I was just thinking like, I remember one time you and I had a conversation. This was a while ago. It was after, I don't know if you came back from New York or I came back from New York, and we were talking about the High Line. Was this with you or is this with
I've
Caitlin?
never actually been to New York, but
It was
my
Caitlin. It was
wife's been. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, John's wife Caitlin, Caitlin and I were talking about this, and we were talking about like the phenomenal urban green space that New York has, despite it being like such a high dense like density population in terms of like, the island of Manhattan, and the High Line in particular, which was like an elevated park space amongst skyscrapers. Like it's a very different feel than like Central Park, which is just like massive. And she had mentioned that you had this vision or like dream to have like these urban connected green spaces or something like that. I guess I was trying to prod you if like you have like ideas or things that like could be possible in our city that maybe sometimes as residents we don't always see because we just like accept the status quo, or like just are comfortable with our situation. I think what you said about the alleys is one of those examples of like, we don't actively use our alleys, or we neglect them both from a city infrastructure perspective and sometimes residents as well. But I'm just curious if you have any thoughts, and maybe you're maybe it was a bit of a what's a sideways question. What's it called when you give somebody a curveball question as well? Hello, Caitlin, by the way.
Caitlin just
Got
dropped in for a quick
10,000
hello.
people watching her right now.
Caitlin,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was just mentioning the High Line conversation that you and I had and how phenomenal of a park it was in New York, and we were chatting about it, but I don't know if that's relevant to the conversation or not. But just like, what kind of visions can we have for our downtown in terms of like, advocacy and park space and all that kind of stuff? That was kind of what I was getting at.
Well, a lot of my visioning and advocacy and creative energies go toward the Ojibwe Prairie and the Ojibwe Prairie complex and the area of West Windsor and LaSalle. And I know that's kind of separate from what we're talking about here.
It's kind of connected though. Like, I mean, a lot of residents, like it's 5-10 minutes away, right? Like, and I can bike there. So, I mean, like it's not totally removed, right? Like it's all kind of connected. But I guess in terms of the downtown neighborhood, it's not directly there. No.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the more sort of current project that is on my mind when it comes to sort of a bigger picture project connecting habitats is the Butterfly Way, and that's the idea of creating a connected linear corridor of native patches of pollinator habitat for to benefit butterflies and other beneficial insects. And I think it's a really cool idea, and I think there's a great opportunity to increase the amount of green space that we have, and like people like seeing butterflies flying around, right? And I think it's a really cool opportunity to use people's love of gardening and of flowers and of plants to increase the amount of green space in the downtown area.
And I just want to give a quick plug, a couple of environmental adjacent programs that we do have that can possibly affect the downtown environment. The tree planting program is one. You can call up the city of Windsor and they will plant for free a native tree in your front lawn on the city right away. I had them plant one at my house. I know a lot of people on my block have had the same experience, and you don't have to go spend $300 on a tree at a nursery. Also, we have community gardens. Again, I know it's not specifically environmental, but it is environmental adjacent because there is that interconnectivity there. And I think we have community gardens, if I'm not mistaken, Mitchell Park,
Weigel, and the one at Bruce moved over to Karen Avenue.
Okay, so we have 3 that are serving our downtown residents, and then so I've got a question, because our next episode I think is going to be about transportation, and I know that transportation can affect our downtown environment, pollution, just the landscaping that we choose to use to promote more walking versus more biking. John, do you see any disadvantages that our downtown residents would have compared to downtown residents in other cities in terms of cleaner, more active transportation?
Disadvantages that we would have relative to other cities. I mean, if you live in a very large urban area in Canada, you have much greater access to public transportation, to active transportation, just maybe perhaps because of the abundance of bike lanes or the greater density for the ability to walk. So I think just living in a smaller city perhaps makes it difficult to access more greener forms of transportation.
And then what about you said you and your wife own one car, is that correct? No, obviously it's not best if you have a gas-powered car it's not environmentally responsible just to get rid of it for the pure sake of getting an electric plug-in. But given a situation, you got your car goes kaput, you need to buy a new car. What would your considerations be as a downtown resident if you wanted to buy a plug-in electric vehicle?
He has an electric vehicle.
Oh, do you? Perfect. So can you tell me some of the challenges you might experience having a plug-in electric vehicle downtown?
Okay.
Because I've got a couple of questions.
Okay. So we have a Pacifica, which is a plug-in electric. It's a hybrid. And I would actually say that because the range of the Pacifica is fairly low relative to fully electric vehicles, if you live outside of downtown, you might have some challenges just in taking full advantage of the fact that it's electric, and perhaps relying more on gasoline. But because we live downtown and the trips that we do make, we're central to the city, so the trips that we do make are relatively short. Most of our driving is electric. Very little of our driving relies on gasoline. Perhaps when we go out to Cottam to visit my dad, or if we do any long trips. But the fact that we do live downtown means that we are able to, and with coupled with the vehicle that we have, we are able to do a lot more of our trips just on electric and just to charge at home. So I can't really comment on the like the number,
like the
challenges in terms
of
charging stations. I know that there are a couple, or at least one not far at the aquatic center, but because we charge at home, don't really need to rely on any of the charging stations or infrastructures that are here in downtown. But I don't think there is that much.
So I guess one thing, because I'm considering getting an electric car for my next vehicle. I do want to make an environmentally conscious decision, but again, like I'm not ready to jump out and throw away a car because I do know that there is an environmental factor in that on its own. But I don't have a driveway and I don't have a garage attached to my alley. And I know I'm not the only one downtown. I think that I would say that's a common problem. And the way you described it, it seems like there's a lot of benefits to having an electric car, especially downtown. It's very useful. But I'm wondering about the people that might not have access to a garage or have access to money to build a garage off their alley. Is this a challenge or am I making this up?
Well, probably it technically is. We plug in, but we use, we're basically plugging in outside, right? So
you have a back parking spot though.
We're probably in the same situation as you in that our parking spot is off the alley and we don't have a garage. And so, we're plugging in, it's outside. So you do have to deal with, we don't have a formal setup right now. So you have to deal with extension cords being put out and taken back in because you're not supposed to leave them out. You do have to, I guess, assume the risk that someone could tamper with your plug at night. We've never really had that issue since we've had our car since May 2018. Ideally, you'd have like a formal outdoor electric setup and in a secure fashion. So there is some there's cost involved with that, right? For doing it properly.
That's interesting. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, sorry. It was a personal concern of mine, and just I know moving forward that might be a common concern. I think bringing it back to the alleys, how important it is in the downtown area to have functional alleys, because you take away those alleys, and I know some we already have. Some people don't even have those back parking areas, and it starts to eliminate those very convenient and very useful options, such as an electric car, from our downtown residents. So just the importance on those alleys for our environment.
Yeah, I think a lot of alleys downtown, like from my observation, and I know that there's actually a map floating around about how many are actually paved and like in use in terms of like garbage collection and stuff like that. Like you would have to probably reconfigure some kind of situation informally, like John's done with like having a back parking space. Like I couldn't imagine it coming, like I'm just thinking for my own house. I mean, right now I have a tiny house back there now, so I don't know what I would have to park in the parking space of the tiny house, but like you would have to park off the back. And I wonder, like, if I just wonder how many houses are set up to do that. Like, I wouldn't know this off the top of my head, but like, I think I never actually like considered like how much of our city could accommodate in like the urban core, like more electric vehicles. And if what you said is true, John, like more people would be actually getting the benefit of them because the trips aren't long. They're 5-10 minutes everywhere you need to go, right? 10 minutes, to South Windsor.
Yeah, and you raised a good point. I actually didn't really think about that if you're only parking on the street, you're not going to be able to charge, right? Like you're going to have public charging stations for those people. And I think that the access to that right now in the core is very limited. Like I said, I know of
there's two
around
spots,
the
I
corner.
think. Yeah.
And I think one of them doesn't work. I've tried to charge there just for fun to see if I had no success. So that's interesting. I've never actually thought about that barrier, that if you don't, if you're on street parking, I mean, what are you going to do? I guess if you're in an apartment or a condo, it's probably pretty easy for there to be an electric charging station in the parking garage, right? Like that. I don't think that would be a problem. I've seen that before in different apartments. So access to the back and parking from the alley would be really key to having access to electricity and to individual charging stations.
Yeah, I think that's I just think that's an interesting point, and I'm glad that we tied it into the environment conversation, because I think it is relevant in terms of like how we make better environmentally friendly and like conscious decisions. And if you are considering that, Matt, like that's a really valid point. And like, how can we advocate for like more of those charging stations or better infrastructure? Like all those things I think are important to consider as you kind of embark on an electric vehicle kind of a quest, I guess. So I'm just I'm sensitive to the time, because I know we were trying to keep these under an hour, and I think we're almost pushing it. Were there any final questions? I guess it's our own thing. We can make it up as we go, but
no, there's a time limit. We got to pay an extra $1 a minute or something.
I'm sensitive to the listeners, aka our moms, who are.
Oh yes, my mom does complain when I go over an hour.
Yeah, but I don't know if there's any other final wrap up questions or comments that any of us have on this topic, or things that we didn't feel like we covered.
Should we turn it to our guest and let our guest ask him if he? We didn't prepare him for this.
I know. I'm like,
no, you didn't really prepare me at all for this. I don't have
gave John a list of questions. That's all he wanted to do.
I wanted to talk about weeds.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we didn't even touch about that. That was his question. Can we talk about weeds?
Like weeds? Like weeds or weed?
Not weed cannabis, like weeds, like plants that are in the wrong place at the wrong time, essentially. It just came up because you guys sent some questions beforehand, and I just thought that was.
We were talking about needles in the alley, but I misspelt needles, and I think it ended up as weedles or weeds. Weeds. Yes, let's talk about weeds.
It wasn't even weeds; it was needles. Oh, I'm sorry.
I didn't know
completely
that.
misunderstood.
I didn't catch that misspelling there.
Yeah.
Well, then we don't have to talk about weeds. Then we can save that for another show.
Isn't Weedle a Pokemon?
Yeah, it's the one with the little spike.
In
right?
all seriousness.
I just think that weeds there's so many plants that are native plants, even non-native, like brought in from Europe, that are just interesting, have interesting histories, that we tend to just write off so quickly as like it's a weed, cut it down, get rid of it. And we end up mowing all kinds of stuff down, that is pollinator habitat when it's goldenrod, or you can make coffee out of chicory root. Like there's just lots of cool plants out there that, especially in cities, we tend to just, if it's not grass, it's garbage, right? And I think that we have a lot to learn from plants. We have a lot to learn from.
I feel like, John, you could do like a whole episode or a whole like series of just like environmental. Do like one episode could be on plants, one could be on weed plants, and like we've got so much knowledge. Like I couldn't even imagine where to start accumulating the knowledge that you have on environment. And I think it's so useful to have people like you in our community, because I don't think we all have to be environmentalists to be pro-environment. I think that we don't have to have this rich knowledge. I think as long as we can raise up the people who have that knowledge and learn from them and reach out and work together, I think as a community, we can do so much more to brighten our downtown area.
I totally agree. So thanks for coming on at late into the night, as you can see from the darkness this time.
It's getting darker in here. Yeah. No, thanks for having me. It was great. I really enjoyed the fire. I feel nice and warm, and I enjoyed the chat, and it was a great time. Thank you.
Yeah, I miss our conversations, especially around the WDNA table, and I appreciate all the work that you did over the last couple of years. And I know that we kind of explained this to you as just like informally connecting with everybody. So thank you for all the time that you put in, both to that group, but also to, hopefully moving forward, what we can do, but also a lot of the activities that you just kind of keep on top of. So I guess we can probably leave it there, eh?
John's going to sing us out.
Oh, yeah. En français, s'il vous plaît.
Non, merci. Non, je ne vais pas chanter pour vous autres.
OK.
Peut-être un autre épisode. Je vais pratiquer en avant.
I was going to say this in French, but I like totally just messed up my words. But all three of us speak French, so we could have had this conversation in French, although I would have been the significantly inferior one here. So.
Then I don't know about your mom. My mom speaks enough French. I don't know if she would watch the video, and then we lose half our audience.
But we could do one you could do it in French that's just like about French, and you could say different.
You can do French in downtown. I mean,
you can talk about
Il y a beaucoup d'histoires en français.
Il y a beaucoup d'histoires, oui. La francophonie ici est très riche.
Mais je prononce le nom de Olette as Olette, not Wallet, okay?
I will go to war about that, because
also it's Pelisher, not Pelissier.
Oh no, I think Pelissier.
I'll say that one.
Okay.
I'm offending all the francophones here, but anyways. Nice to chat with you guys, and I'm going to stop the recording now because I have the power. So.